A single document lands, and the air inside the royal world changes instantly. In this fictional account, the palace issues a chilling demand: Diana and Fergie must stop speaking to the press, no exceptions, no misunderstandings, no private backchannels. What looks like a simple media rule is actually a power play. Because when a palace bans your voice, it's not protecting you, it's containing you. And containment always comes with a cost. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It begins with a dramatized directive leak, the kind that doesn't need a stamp of authenticity, because the reaction to it is the proof. One line is enough to freeze every handler and aide, enough to turn soft conversations into clipped whispers, enough to make even the most seasoned courtiers look suddenly cautious. In a palace, words on paper carry a different weight than words spoken aloud. Paper becomes policy. Policy becomes reality. And reality becomes fear. Because this isn't just instruction. It's the palace drawing a boundary around two women it has decided are too loud, too unpredictable, too capable of controlling their own narratives. The stakes are immediate, and brutal press contact equals influence, leverage, and survival. In this fictional world, the press is not merely a mirror, it's oxygen. It's a lifeline when the palace turns cold. It's the only place a person can speak without permission. So when the palace demands silence, it's not requesting discretion. It's severing a lifeline. It's saying, your version of events is no longer allowed to exist. And the cruelty of it is the politeness, how the demand is framed, as for the good of everyone, while everyone inside knows it's designed to shrink someone without ever admitting that shrinking is happening. The palace frames the demand as a response to escalating embarrassment and internal fear, because institutions always justify control as protection. The public would be told it's about dignity. Inside, it's about panic. Panic that the story is slipping. Panic that two women, each with their own audience and their own emotional gravity, might become an unpredictable force, especially if they are treated not as individuals to manage, but as an alliance to neutralize. Diana and Fergie, in this dramatized narrative, are unlikely allies linked by shared experience, mutual exposure, and the private understanding that the palace treats women as variables in its survival equation. That's why the directive doesn't read like a rule. It reads like a containment strategy aimed at preventing coordination. And once a palace chooses containment, the isolation tactics follow like clockwork. Invitations vanish, calls go unanswered, doors close softly, the way palaces close doors without drama, without explanation, with plausible deniability built into every silence. A schedule changes, and suddenly the wrong people can't cross paths. A security concern appears, and suddenly proximity becomes impossible. A timing issue emerges, and suddenly a meeting never happens. The outside world sees nothing. Inside, the targets feel their world narrowing. That's the genius of the cage. It can be built quietly enough that the public won't notice until it's already locked. And that brings us to the central question that turns this from discipline into conspiracy: who pushed for this order, and what are they hiding? Because directives like this don't appear out of nowhere. They are pushed, written, approved, carried through a chain of human agendas. Someone convinced the palace that silence was necessary. Someone argued that Diana and Fergie were risks worth containing. Someone decided that their voices were more dangerous than the backlash that might come from silencing them. In this fictional account, the real threat is not the press itself, it's what the press might hear if the women are allowed to speak freely. Then comes the cliffhanger detail that makes the directive feel less like policy and more like punishment. It includes a second clause. Not just stop speaking, but something colder, something that alters access, limits movement, or reshapes relationships under the polite label of protocol. A clause that doesn't merely restrict communication, but tightens the world around them, ensuring that even silence won't be enough. Because the palace's goal isn't to quiet them for a week, it's to make them smaller over time, until the public forgets they were ever powerful enough to be feared. But to understand why a palace would silence two women so aggressively, we have to step into the monarchy's oldest battlefield: control of the story. In this dramatized world, the palace doesn't fear scandal as much as it fears unmanaged truth. The press isn't just publicity, it's a weapon that can crown you or erase you. That's why stop speaking isn't a request, it's a chokehold. Because once the palace loses control of the narrative, it loses control of the hierarchy. And when hierarchy is threatened, the palace doesn't negotiate, it tightens. Narrative control, in this fictional palace logic, isn't vanity. It's survival instinct. The crown doesn't just rule through tradition, it rules through belief, and belief is built by stories repeated until they feel inevitable. That's why approved voices are rewarded. You get invited, you get photographed, you get treated as stable, dignified, worthy of protection. Meanwhile, independent voices, people who speak without permission, are punished. Not always loudly, often quietly. Because the palace understands something most institutions learn the hard way: if you can't control what's said, you control who gets heard. And the deepest fear is parallel storytelling. Not a tabloid headline, not a temporary scandal. Parallel storytelling means insiders telling a different version of reality than the palace version, two narratives running at the same time, competing for the public's trust. The monarchy can outlast many storms, but it struggles when it cannot decide what the storm means. That's why containment protocols exist in this dramatized world: silence first, separation second. Stop the voice, then remove the proximity, then reduce access, then build a reality in which the person is present but irrelevant. The press, of course, makes everything worse. Tabloids are hungry, insiders are tempted, reputations are fragile, and the palace knows that one unguarded quote can become an anchor for years of scrutiny. So it tightens. It claims it's protecting dignity. But what it's really protecting is the chain of command, because hierarchy depends on controlled messaging: who can speak, when they can speak, what they're allowed to imply. Once that chain breaks, it reveals the monarchy's most dangerous weakness: it is a family pretending to be an institution. And institutions don't like being reminded they're human. That's where the conflict intensifies. Because Diana and Fergie refuse to be managed the same way. In this fictional account, they are two different personalities with two different survival instincts, one more defiant, one more adaptive, but both allergic to being edited. The palace can handle one problem at a time. One loud voice is manageable. One uncomfortable figure can be isolated and reframed. But two voices, moving independently, create a risk the palace can't easily contain. They can validate each other's experience. They can corroborate. They can compare timelines. And once they compare timelines, contradictions surface. Then comes the cliffhanger that makes the order feel colder than optics. A court insider hints the directive wasn't about image, it was about evidence. If that's true, the palace isn't merely afraid of embarrassment. It's afraid of what could be proven. Afraid of what two women might hold in memory, in letters, in private conversations, in patterns that only become obvious when you put them side by side. And if evidence is the fear, then the press order isn't a public relations move, it's a preemptive strike. And if it's about evidence, then we need to understand why Diana and Fergie together are uniquely dangerous. They were never supposed to be a team. In this alternate timeline thriller, Diana and Fergie form a bond the palace can't predict and can't control, a bond built on shared humiliation, survival instinct, and the quiet knowledge that they've seen too much. Alone, each is manageable. Together, they become a mirror that reflects the palace's ugliest truths. And the palace doesn't smash mirrors gently. Their friendship begins as emotional refuge, two women surviving the same machine, learning that kindness is scarce and trust is expensive. But refuge becomes leverage the moment they start understanding each other's experience in a way the palace cannot interrupt. Shared experiences create mutual understanding, and mutual understanding creates a private language. A set of conclusions the palace can't edit because it can't see it forming. That's why the bond becomes threatening. Because it isn't just emotional, it's informational. In this dramatized arc, they begin comparing notes, not because they're plotting like villains, but because survival demands clarity. A conversation here, a contradiction there, a promise that didn't match the outcome, a pattern of who appeared when, who was punished, who was protected. Alone, each woman can be dismissed as emotional. Together, their stories align. And alignment is power, because it turns he said, she said into we both saw it. The palace fears two voices for one reason above all two voices can corroborate, not just accuse. That creates inner conflict. Loyalty to family versus loyalty to self. Loyalty to tradition versus loyalty to truth. They are not revolutionaries, they are women in a cage, deciding whether the cage is safer than freedom. And as the palace tightens its grip, betrayal risk rises. Someone will try to split them apart. Offer one comfort in exchange for silence. Offer one protection in exchange for distance. In palaces, friendship is always tested by incentives, because incentives reveal who is truly alone. Then the panic spark hits a private conversation is overheard or reported. A sentence carried to the wrong ears. A detail repeated by the wrong person. Suddenly the palace believes the mirror is not only reflecting, it's preparing to show others what it sees. And once the palace panics, it doesn't just issue rules, it builds a cage. In the palace's world, exile doesn't require a public banishment. It requires silence, distance, and the slow disappearance of your place in the room. In this dramatization, the press order is only phase 1. Phase 2 is isolation, fewer invitations, tighter schedules, security concerns, sudden changes in who's allowed to see whom. And the most brutal part? It's designed to look normal. Because soft exile is the palace's cleanest punishment. It leaves no headline, no courtroom, no dramatic confrontation the public can rally around. It operates through scheduling, access control, social freezing, the quiet engineering of loneliness. An invitation is lost. A meeting is rescheduled. A call isn't returned. A door that once opened easily now requires permission, and permission somehow never arrives. The targets remain technically present in royal life, but functionally removed from it. That's the trick isolation that keeps the public unaware while breaking the person privately. Handlers and courtiers enforce the cage with polite language, because politeness is how cruelty wears gloves. Everything is framed as concern for your protection, for everyone's privacy. We don't want to inflame the press. The words sound reasonable, but the effect is ruthless. You are cut off from the rooms where decisions are made, from the moments where influence is exchanged, from the casual warmth that reminds you you're still human. And when influence is removed, dignity starts to wobble. You begin to question whether you exist at all in the institution's eyes, or whether you've become a problem being managed until it disappears. Loneliness becomes weaponized against both women in slightly different ways. Diana is isolated to reduce her voice. Fergie is isolated to reduce her credibility. They are kept separate not just geographically, but emotionally through subtle pressure that makes each doubt the other's loyalty. Because the palace aims to force compliance by creating desperation. Desperate people make mistakes. They reach out. They plead. They react. And reaction can be labeled instability, which then justifies further containment. It's a self-feeding loop built to make resistance look like proof of guilt. But there's a danger the palace always underestimates. Isolation can create recklessness, not obedience. When you take away someone's normal channels, they don't always become quieter. Sometimes they become smarter. Sometimes they become sharper. Sometimes they stop trying to be understood by the palace and start trying to outmaneuver it. That is the risk of soft exile. It can turn sadness into strategy. And then comes the moment that proves the cage is real. A trusted friend disappears, or is reassigned overnight. In a palace, disappearance doesn't need explanation. One day someone is your bridge to information, to reassurance, to normal human contact. The next day, they're gone. New posting. Different priorities. Nothing personal. But the message is unmistakable: you are being cut off. The system is sealing itself. And if it can remove your friend without warning, it can remove your sense of safety just as easily. But isolation only works if the target breaks, and Diana, in this story, doesn't break quietly. The palace expects compliance. It expects a bowed head and a forced smile. But in this fictional account, the demand to stop speaking to the press flips a switch in Diana, because silence doesn't feel like protection. It feels like erasure, and erasure is the one thing she refuses. This is where the story turns from containment to confrontation, because once Diana decides the cage is real, she begins looking for the lock. Her internal conflict is immediate and volcanic: fear, rage, resolve, clarity, sometimes all in the same breath. Fear because she understands how powerful the machine is. Rage because she recognizes the insult beneath the concern. Resolve because she realizes begging won't work. Clarity because the order reveals the truth the palace never says aloud: this is about control, not care. Once she sees that, she stops reacting the way the palace expects. She becomes quieter in public but sharper in private. Strategic silence, not surrender planning. And planning begins with documentation. Dates, messages, patterns, who said what and when, who stopped returning calls, which invitation vanished, which corridor went cold. Diana understands that the palace thrives on plausible deniability, and the only antidote to deniability is a record that cannot be gaslit. The more the palace tries to erase her, the more she collects proof that erasure is happening. Not to publish immediately, but to protect herself from being rewritten later. Family tension rises as allies vanish and sympathizers get punished. People who once offered warmth suddenly become distant, not because they stopped caring, but because they fear being punished by proximity. Diana watches it happen and learns a painful lesson in a palace: kindness is often conditional. That doesn't soften her. It hardens her. And it pushes her toward a counter-move the palace didn't anticipate, finding a way to communicate without speaking. Not direct press quotes, but signals. Intermediaries. Carefully timed appearances. Quiet humanitarian moves that generate attention without a single sanctioned statement. If the palace wants to ban her voice, she finds another language. Then the warning arrives, the one that doesn't sound like advice anymore. It sounds like a threat. A message delivered through the correct channel, with the correct calm: stop pushing, or the next phase will be worse. And that's the moment Diana understands the true stakes. This is no longer about headlines. It's about who gets to exist publicly as themselves. And while Diana prepares to fight, Fergie faces a different danger: being blamed as the easiest scapegoat. In this dramatized timeline, the palace doesn't punish evenly. It punishes strategically. And Fergie, with fewer protectors and less mythic shielding, becomes the obvious target, the one the machine can crush without risking backlash. The press order becomes a trap: one mistake, one misunderstood comment, and she becomes the cautionary tale. And once you're a cautionary tale, you stop being family and become an example. Because vulnerability is not just emotional in a palace. It's structural. Fergie, in this fictional account, has fewer allies willing to take a hit for her, thinner institutional protection, and a reputation the palace can reshape without triggering the same outrage that comes from touching a more mythic figure. That makes her useful to the machine. When the palace wants compliance, it doesn't only threaten, it demonstrates. It shows what happens when you resist. And the safest demonstration is the person the public is least likely to defend with fury. So blame gets redirected with precision. Any tension around the press becomes her fault. Any leak becomes her circle. Any improvised moment becomes her recklessness. This is how the palace preserves higher status figures by feeding the narrative toward the most expendable one. It doesn't need to invent a brand new story, it only needs to nudge existing assumptions until they harden into certainty. And once certainty exists, it becomes a cage made of public opinion, which is the strongest cage of all, because it polices the target without the palace lifting a finger. The emotional toll is brutal. Shame mixes with anger, and anger collides with the urge to survive at any cost. Because survival in a monarchy is often less about dignity and more about endurance. The pressure tactics tighten financial squeeze disguised as budget adjustments, social distance disguised as scheduling, access to children framed as best interests, invitations that vanish without explanation. Each pressure point is chosen because it hurts without looking like cruelty. Each one pushes Fergie closer to the edge where she might make a mistake, and in this trap, mistakes are the product. Then the palace deploys its most vicious strategy: split them up. Push Fergie to distance from Diana. Make the alliance feel unsafe. Make friendship look like liability. Offer her a way out that requires abandonment. In a palace, forgive and move forward often means separate and comply. And that forces a moral test that feels impossible: betray Diana and save yourself, or stay loyal and be destroyed together. It's a test designed to break bonds, because bonds are what make two isolated people dangerous. And then Fergie hears the phrase that confirms the machine's intent, delivered casually, as if it's obvious she's expendable. Not shouted, not announced, just stated like an internal truth everyone already lives by. In that moment, she understands she isn't being disciplined as family. She's being used as an example. And examples are meant to be painful enough that others comply without being asked. And when someone becomes expendable, the next step is always the same: a leak carefully aimed to turn the world against them. The moment the palace's silence order slips beyond the gates, it stops being internal discipline and becomes a public referendum on cruelty and control. In this story, anonymous sources surface, narratives harden, and the palace's refusal to comment becomes gasoline. Suddenly, Diana and Fergie aren't just isolated, they're being framed. And the world is being invited to decide whether they're victims or threats that had to be contained. It starts with strategic leaking. Because the palace understands a brutal truth: whoever frames first, wins first. Timed whispers appear: just enough detail to sound credible, not enough to be traced. Clarifications follow that don't clarify, they steer. The story is positioned as necessary discipline rather than coercion, as privacy protection rather than silencing. Coordinated framing turns a cruel order into a reasonable boundary, and once it's reasonable, anyone resisting it looks unreasonable. That is how narrative warfare works: make control sound like care. The public polarizes instantly. Sympathy surges for those who look trapped. Suspicion surges for those painted as unstable. The media machine does what it always does: it feeds on emotional conflict, looping outrage and pity until both become entertainment. Every panel discussion turns into a trial. Every headline chooses a villain. And the palace's silence becomes evidence. Non-denial becomes confirmation. The lack of comment becomes a statement louder than any statement, because it suggests the palace is too invested to deny and too afraid to explain. Inside the gates, the stakes rise again. Staff are forced to pick camps. Loyalty tests intensify. People stop speaking freely and start speaking in fragments. Because leaks don't just expose the target, they expose the system that is targeting them. And the palace, panicking, tries to contain the narrative without admitting it ever issued a chokehold in the first place. That's the trap: admit it and look cruel, deny it and look guilty, stay silent and watch the story grow teeth. Then comes the cliffhanger that turns the scandal into a threat: a name surfaces: who authorized the order and who benefits most. Once that happens, the story stops being about the palace as a faceless institution. It becomes about a person, a decision maker, a strategist, a hand that moved behind the curtain. And the moment a hand is visible, the world starts demanding consequences. And once names enter the arena, this isn't gossip anymore, it's betrayal with fingerprints. A palace can silence your voice, but it can't silence your strategy. In this dramatized arc, the isolation pushes Diana and Fergie towards something the monarchy fears most: coordination. Not emotional venting, calculated resistance. They begin using intermediaries, coded timing and pressure points the institution can't easily control. And suddenly, the press order becomes the palace's worst mistake, because it forces them to evolve from targets into players. It starts with a shift so quiet it almost looks like resignation. But it isn't. It's planning. The fear that once made them cautious hardens into a single truth: we can't keep waiting. Waiting is what the palace expects. Waiting is how the cage becomes normal. So they stop waiting, not with reckless public explosions, but with deliberate moves that deny the palace what it wants most: predictability. Indirect channels appear, because direct channels are trapped. Trusted friends become bridges. Allies become messengers. Deniable messages move through hands that don't carry royal titles, through conversations that can't be traced to a single phone call. Timing becomes coded. Appearances become signals. Silence itself becomes language. And the genius of it is that it doesn't violate the stop speaking to the press order in a simple, punishable way. It bends around it. It creates meaning without confession, sympathy without statements, pressure without signatures. They learn to leverage public sympathy without direct press contact. Because sympathy is not just an emotion, it's a force. A carefully timed visit, a perfectly chosen gesture, a moment of visible calm where the palace expected visible collapse. The public begins to feel the shape of a story the palace can't fully control: two women being squeezed, not protected. And that feeling becomes dangerous, because once the public senses injustice, it starts asking who benefits from silence. It starts looking for fingerprints. The palace scrambles. Counter leaks surge. Intimidation tightens. Containment becomes more aggressive, not less, because institutions often mistake resistance for proof that their control wasn't strong enough. So schedules tighten again. Access narrows again. Threats become more subtle and more personal. But the harder the palace pushes, the clearer the pattern becomes, and patterns are what turn suspicion into belief. The emotional stakes rise too, because coordination isn't easy when survival is on the line. Friendship strains under pressure. One moment requires courage, another requires restraint, and the line between courage and recklessness becomes painfully thin. Diana's instinct leans toward confrontation. Fergie's instinct leans toward survival. Both are valid, both are dangerous. And the palace knows that the easiest way to end coordination is to fracture it from the inside, by offering one woman safety if she abandons the other. That's why a high-risk move begins to form one action that could expose everything. Not necessarily a public tell-all, but something cleaner and sharper, an undeniable signal that the palace cannot dismiss as rumor. A message prepared with precision, designed to collapse the palace narrative by revealing the one thing the palace cannot survive: losing control of meaning. And the cliffhanger lands like a held breath. A final message is prepared, one that could collapse the palace narrative. But every counterstrike has a price, and the palace's final move is always to protect itself by rewriting the story. If the palace demands silence, it's never just to stop the press, it's to stop the future. In this final chapter of our fictional thriller, we connect every thread: the directive, the isolation, the scapegoating, the leaks, and the counterstrike. And we ask the most unsettling question of all: when the crown forces women into silence to protect itself, does it preserve stability, or does it create the very collapse it fears? Because the win conditions in this world are cold and clear. Whose image improves when two voices are contained? The institutions, at least in the short term. Whose power consolidates when independent narrators are removed from the board? The gatekeepers, the strategists, the people who survive by controlling what the public is allowed to believe. But power gained through silencing always carries a hidden cost. It turns personal relationships into weapons and turns the family into a machine that eats its own tenderness. That's the tragedy at the center of this story. Relationships are sacrificed for institutional control. Loyalty becomes conditional. Love becomes risk. And once the palace establishes the precedent that it can silence these voices, it becomes easier to silence anyone. That is how a temporary order becomes a permanent policy. Not because the palace is evil, but because it is terrified of losing narrative ownership. In this dramatized reality, the true motive isn't family unity. It's story ownership. It's deciding what happened, what mattered, and who gets to define it. And the haunting implication is this: survival through containment becomes addictive. The palace learns that isolation works, so it uses it again. It learns that scapegoating calms storms, so it repeats the pattern. It learns that silence buys time, so it demands silence whenever fear rises. But fear never stops rising forever, which leads to the final cliffhanger question that refuses to leave you alone: who is the next risk the palace will try to erase when the next crisis hits? Because once you see silence used as a weapon, you start recognizing its shape everywhere: polite language, closed doors, vanished invitations, rewritten reputations. And the call to action is simple question: how power uses silence to control the story. And what happens to a monarchy when it relies on containment instead of truth? Because the real shock isn't that the palace demanded silence, it's what that demand reveals about how far it will go to control the story. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.